And in another one of your books, Italian Vices, you examine the cultural stereotypes Italians used about themselves. How do these self-stereotypes connect to broader questions of racism and national identity in Italy?
Yeah, it's this was an interesting thing for me because I kept reading Italian journalists speaking about an Italian character. An Italian character can have both a positive side and a negative side. And they often, right, the positive side is this idea that Italians are altogether good people, that they are not racist, and so on. The negative side is the let's say, this kind of discourse that is a bit self-denigratory. The idea that Italy, because Italy is not really in this, it's been was in a period of decline for a long period of decline. It did not develop some sort of good habits and ethics. For example, there was the idea that among even the patriots of the Risorgimento, that Italians were lazy, or later were undisciplined, right? So there were big generalization made by elite Italians who were looking quite down on the others, but because they wanted to reform them, right? So with the Risorgimento, this is the idea that Italy has to become a great power, and in order to be a great power, Italians have to change their ways, right? They have to be more industrious, and they have to be, more disciplined and so on. And that is connected also to a certain view of the South as being the most sort of the laziest, the most undisciplined part of the country. So there was this kind of a creation of the South as something very different from the rest of the country. Yeah, so sort of something like we call the other of Italy,
Yeah.
right? As if it was not really Italian, but it was somewhat linked to, this idea, this stereotype of Africa as a more primitive place. And so the Italians of the South were represented in that way. So this kind of discourse that of self-stereotypes is also linked to a perception of the South as more backward than the rest of Italy, and somehow not really Italian. It's the other of Italy. So Italy constructs itself by denying this part of itself. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
By saying, we want to be a modern nation and very different from them. And continuing again, this is also something that continues because in when I talked about the Northern League as this movement that wanted even a secession of the northern regions from the rest of Italy, because they say if we continue to be in Italy, we have to pay more for the South that is undeveloped, right? The South is a burden for us. So you see that even if this was a movement that came up in the 1980s, 1990s. So, the persistence of this kind of negative stereotypes of the South continued for a long time and is still relevant today.
And
I mean, today it's probably less openly so, but again, among sort of ordinary Italians, it's not disappeared completely. This kind of racialization of the Southerners who, became somehow the epitome of that, what is negative in Italy.
and this perception of the South as other, as separate from like the North and the rest of Italy, was that ever codified into law, or was that just a general public perception of Italy itself?
It was not codified into law, but perceptions were mattered in the way in which they shape behavior. For example, when there was a mass immigration of Southerners to the northern factories after 45, there were people who didn't want to have anything to do with them. I mean, they were okay to work in these factories. They worked in this factory, but for example, they had problems finding housing, in cities, right? Because they
Yeah.
were seen as non-trustworthy, somehow very different than the rest. And some people have said that kind of, you know, internal xenophobia, if you want, or
Yeah.
internal racism. It's a bit the basis also for the rejection of people who come from outside of Italy, right?
Yeah.
Because there is already this kind of misperception of a part of Italians, essentially.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. And what do Italy's struggles with nationalism and identity teach us about how other countries deal with their past more generally?
Yeah, I would say that this is right fairly common. This struggling with the past for many countries who had maybe civil wars in the past, who had if I think about moments of great division, I'm thinking about the rise of fascism, for example. Right, that was a quasi-civil war that led to the rise of fascism. And
Yeah,
so, you will have people on one side and on the other who have very different memories, and maybe they don't accept the official account, right? After the fall of fascism, the anti-fascists were the victors, and so they created a new democratic constitution. But they also created, of course, a memory that was, centered around the resistance against fascism. And for a while there was a consensus around that. And then with the 90s, that consensus broke down because the political party system fell apart. And at that point, the heirs, the neo-fascists, sort of, who at that point called themselves post-fascist. I mean, they say we have nothing to do with that. Fascism is over. So there was at that point a let's say a much more conflict in the open, right, at that point. And here there was a moment for the revision of also of the past, of the stories, the official story told about the past, or at least an attempt to revise that history. So let's say that um, you know this history is not again, not unique to Italy, because other countries also see this kind of change over time in the way they relate to their past. So today too, we could say in relation to colonialism, for a while, colonialism was somehow forgotten or was, you know, in the general memory associated to the image of the good Italian. But then in more recent year, people have questioned that image. And so they have rewritten the history of colonialism, of Italian colonialism. And yet there are people who do not accept that rewriting, right? So, it's a struggle that goes on, but I don't see it as being anomalous. I see it as being, existing in many countries which had a past with which they still have to come to terms with.
that makes a
Yeah,
lot of sense.
even our own country, there is always an attempt to revisit the past. I mean, there are sort of struggles around the past because the
Yeah, of
past,
course.
right, as can have different meanings to different people, right?
Yeah.
And finding an acceptable kind of story that many people can accept, it's necessary. I mean, it's important because if you have too many, very different views. This can serve to polarize the country.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. And finally, looking ahead, what advice would you give to students trying to understand European history and the complexities of national identity today?
I would say I would encourage to concentrate on three things in particular. I would say for understanding Europe and the creation of national identity, you have to look first of all at the way in which states were formed over time, right? In very different ways. If you think about the 19th century, many different countries had started to see national movements emerging then, but then there are wars that create new states after World War I. So it's a complex history, but you have to start with that. Think about also Ukraine, right? The creation of Ukraine and other states out of the fall of Russia in 1917, 1918, with the rise of the Soviet Union and so on.
Yeah,
So complex history. Then the second one would be ideology, the study, pay attention to the study of ideological formation in the sense that, for example, besides nationalism and liberalism in Europe, the importance of socialism. Right, socialism is very important for understanding the development of European countries, and I think especially about social democrats, which are at the basis of the creation of welfare states.
Yeah,
And welfare states are still very important for, I would say a European identity, right, that differentiate the Europe from other countries in which they don't exist,
of course.
or exist in different ways. And then the third thing I would say, pay attention to also the way in which Europe is created, also always in, at least for the 20th century, in contact with the US, right? So the history, you cannot study, especially after 45, if you are interested in that, you cannot study the history of Europe without, right, this kind of a connection with the history of the US, which becomes the hegemonic power after 45. So I would say, it's important to study Europe within the borders, but also Europe outside of its borders to understand fully its history.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you taking the time and agreeing to talk to me. I know it's later in the evening, close to night. So I thank you so much for this.
It's my pleasure. I hope that I am, that it was useful for the question that you had. That I think were very good questions, and I
Thank you so much. And it was great. I really appreciate it.